I say this every single time because this whole conference is like a set of 6. And so if you want to get the whole picture, you need to go all the way back to session 1. Watch that first because it's kind of in succession. Because people just tune in at different times and they'll just flip on number 4 without realizing they have the other ones. I'll just tell you that's where you'll hear more about Joel Richardson and his ministry. If you want to know more about his ministry, it's joelstrumpet.com. Once again, I forgot my thing. What is my problem there? Serious. I'm just not used to this. I've been the one that's been doing this for the whole presentations, and I'm pretty proud of myself that I'm keeping up. Here you go, womensbiblestudy.com. That's how you can watch this conference. You can also watch it through downloading our apps. Our Women's Bible Study app, YouTube, Roku, iTunes podcasting, blah, blah, blah. You're sick of hearing me say that. If you want the handouts for the conference, it's in the right-hand corner at the very top. It says handouts. If you just hit that, type in the conference name, and then you will get the handouts. If you want to know more about Joel's ministry, joelstrumpet.com. He has lots of videos. You definitely want to go on there and find that out. So we want to get to it. So please welcome for session 4, Joel Richardson.
All right. We have passed through the digestion stage. And now we're getting our second wind. So this brother just told me that Arizona has more boats than per capita than any other state. Where do you guys put them? I flew in here. In the garage. I mean, I flew in and I was looking out. Where do they go? You have lakes around Phoenix? Really? You don't just wait till it rains and just go in those washes and go down to the next neighborhood and go, "Hey, Jam, I got a boat." I grew up on the Atlantic Ocean. My dad's a commercial fisherman, so I moved to Missouri, and they got rivers. They got something called catfish. It's like, ooh, like deep fried mud nuggets. Like so that's when I said, heck with it, let's just do barbecue. And that's when once I got Kansas City barbecue down, I was happy. All right, so Daniel chapter 8. We're going to jump into, the title of this session is The Clashing of the Ram and the Goat. This is another passage that is very symbolic. It's got a lot of, this is classic apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature generally means literature from a particular time in history that's filled with a lot of symbolism. It doesn't mean it usually pertains to the end times and so forth, but it's a particular genre. It's a particular type of literature. And some books have a chapter which is apocalyptic, and then Daniel, for instance, has some chapters that are apocalyptic and then other chapters that are historical narrative. Daniel 8 is, it's a mixture of both, but it's largely a very apocalyptic chapter. Here we're going to dial down into some very specifics, some very specific details concerning what we should look for. Now, I want to be clear. My approach to the end times is, I just presented an argument in the last session on Daniel 2, but I want to be clear, again, I'm not telling you, don't listen to this other particular teacher who believes that it's going to come from the Roman Empire. I'm not saying those guys are wrong. I'm right. What I'm saying is be Bereans. Be informed of all the different positions and be aware, right? Because look, it's the dumbest thing in the world to argue about future speculative eschatology. I'll go to bat against the Trinity. I'll go to bat against the incarnation of God in Christ, like the historical doctrines of the Christian faith, the cross, the historicity. Like these things are non-negotiable. Biblical prophecy is not something to divide over. Now, concerning the essence of the big story of redemption, I will debate and I will challenge robustly replacement theology because it leads, in my opinion, it leads to the mistreatment of the Jewish people. I also think it robs us of actual biblical hope. And so to me that's important. But when it comes to stuff like this, which nation is going to attack which nation, where's the Antichrist going to come from, these type of details, that's not stuff you fight over. That's not stuff you divide over. That's stuff you can robustly discuss with one another and be happy to have disagreements and respect and love one another. but it's definitely not something to fight over. But we're going to get into kind of a very different interpretation of Daniel chapter 8. It's a very important text. And let me say this too, by the way. The book of Daniel, perhaps more than almost any other book in the Bible, has been attacked, has been criticized by German higher critical scholars for a couple hundred years. And they argue it was not really written by Daniel. It was written by a Daniel pretender, a pseudo-Daniel, 300 years or so after the real Daniel would have been alive. And it's amazing how widely accepted this kind of view almost has become. Even some conservative scholars will kind of be like, well, it doesn't really have to have been written by the real Daniel still to be Scripture. And I go, what? Like, you can't say Scripture, the Word of God, was written by a liar. And that Jesus said, you know, as it was written in the book by Daniel, like if it's not written by Daniel, then Jesus was wrong. It undermines everything. But I believe the reason that Satan has gone after the book of Daniel is because I do believe it's one of the most important manuals for the end times church to pay attention to. And I believe this particular chapter is one of the most detailed and important chapters that we should be paying attention to right now. So I'm going to begin with verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel. So Daniel had the vision in Daniel chapter 7, which is the 4 gruesome beasts. We're not going to get into that today. But then following on that, he has another vision. And it's, as I said, filled with a lot of symbolism. Go to the next slide, which is another map. Okay, so this one's very clear. You've got Israel over here. Again, I put the Star of David on it. When Daniel was given this vision, he was in the city called Susa. That's the green star over there on the right. That's where he was, or at least he was actually in Babylon, which is, let's say, just at the bottom of the queue in Iraq. But then in the vision, he saw himself over there in Susa. Today, it's called Shush, still there to this day, in the nation of Iran. Back then, it was called the province of Persia, called Elam, the southwestern province of Persia called Elam. So that's where he was. And then in verse 3 through 4, he says, behold, this is what he saw. Behold, a ram which had 2 horns. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beasts could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. So you see this, Daniel sees this 2-horned ram, and he's coming from the region of modern-day Iran, ancient Elam, ancient Persia, and he's butting out, like as a ram does, westward, northward, and southward, and no one could stand before him. He was, the undisputed world champion. Whenever I read this passage, I'm always thinking about, like a boxer, or if you like to watch MMA, mixed martial arts, if you're into watching boxing, it's kind of one of these things where you're like, man, so-and-so, he's like the undefeated champion. No one can beat this guy. He just runs the gauntlet and just beats everyone out. You're like, man, this guy is undefeated until someone comes along and beats him, right? Like, eventually everyone turns 40, or in Brady's case, whatever, 44, hopefully, whatever it's going to be. Eventually, someone else comes along, but in the meantime, no one could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased. I can't possibly be beat, and magnified himself. Go to the next slide. So essentially what it's describing is a ram, again, from Persia, and he's butting out to the north, to the south, and to the west, throughout the heart of the Middle East, into Iraq, into Syria, into Lebanon, toward Israel, even south toward Saudi Arabia. Okay, so it's really pretty straightforward. Then verses 5 through 6. While I was observing, so he's watching the ram, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. So, again, it's a great memory jog. It's a unicorn goat. No one will forget the unicorn goat. But really, it's what it is. He has a single horn between his eyes. Probably what Daniel saw was more like a deformed goat, that just had some weird horn, not like a unicorn goat. And it's interesting that he's coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth, so he's kind of like a Superman unicorn goat. Da, 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 da. Right, because you've seen the YouTube videos. The goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram, and here it is. He rushed at him in mighty wrath. Verse 7, I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him. He struck the ram. He shattered his two horns. The ram had no strength to withstand him. He hurled him to the ground, and he trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. So the goat represents Patrick Mahomes, the greatest of all time, defeating the previous. Just kidding. That's true. That's the inspired interpretation. But here we are, right? Here we have the goat, and now the goat defeats what previously just looked like no one could defeat the ram, and there was none to rescue from his power. Actually, go ahead and no, I'm going to read this next verse. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, so he saw the vision, I sought to understand it. Now, this is an example of what I mean. What are we talking about here? Goats, horns, rams, what does any of this mean? Then comes the divine angel from the throne of God to explain it. Daniel goes I really wanted to understand this. Standing before me was one who looked like a man. And he called out and he said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So Gabriel is in the house. Gabriel is present. Gabriel, the messenger angel. Gabriel, the one that appeared to little Mary, is here explaining to Daniel the meaning, the understanding of the vision. Now, the next slide. I have almost 200 commentaries on the book of Daniel. I love commentaries. I'm a commentary guy. I love studying biblical commentaries. And with Daniel in particular, what I've loved to do is to go back to the early centuries of the church, and we've only got a handful of commentaries on the book of Daniel that are from the early few centuries. Jerome has one. There's Hippolytus. There's a few of the early church writers that. So we can look in there, we go, well, here's what the early church guys at least were talking about and speculating, and then follow that forward throughout history and go, what do we think it means now, today? Because there's actually a difference between what the early church believed and what we believe today. But I love surveying history and trying to understand it. Now, virtually every commentary that you get that's written by a believer, because it's crazy that there's commentaries written by total non-believers, but anyone that's written by a believer generally is going to say that what the vision is talking about is Medo-Persia, ancient Medo-Persia, that exploded across the whole Middle East in ancient times. And then Alexander the Great, okay, this is a mosaic of Alexander the Great, and he is the goat. He is the unicorn goat. That's Greece. And it exploded out of Macedonia across the whole Middle East and defeated the Medo-Persian Empire. That's what every commentary is going to say. And then they'll say that that's history, but at the tail end of the vision, which we'll get into, it then bleeds into the last days and it gives us foreshadows and a little hint about the Antichrist. That's pretty much what most commentaries will say. Skip forward 2 slides. I'm going to argue or just present an alternative interpretation, and I'm always super leery of anybody that has a new interpretation of end-time prophecy because there's so much of it out there. Everybody just wants to come up with some weird, new, unique idea. It's very strange. I'm very hesitant to ever embrace new ideas. However, I think in this case, I think a different interpretation is seriously merited by the text. Like anybody who looks at this seriously has to go, yeah, that's actually a really solid argument. And what I'm going to argue is that all of the vision, yes, it was fulfilled in history in terms of a foreshadow, but all of the vision pertains to the last days. that the whole thing is a very detailed overview of events to watch for in arguably our day that lead up to the coming of the Antichrist and the return of Jesus. So why do I believe that? Verse 17, Gabriel comes. He came near to me where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened, and I fell on my face, but he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. It's pretty clear, pretty straightforward. Daniel, if you want to know what the vision is about, it's about the end times. Daniel, the vision begins in history. It deals with Medo-Persia and Greece. But eventually it overlaps and it bleeds in. No, he doesn't say that. He goes, it's about the end times. Daniel falls down and falls into a deep sleep, which is weird because he's in a vision already. He has a vision that he's sleeping. It's like, man, what did you dream last night? I dreamt I was sleeping all night long. You know, it's like, it's weird. And then Gabriel picks him up. He picks him up. And in verse 19, he said, Behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation. This is a very specific phrase. It comes from Moses in Deuteronomy, chapter 32. It comes from Isaiah. The final period of indignation is ultimately against the nations. God's indignation is against the nations for how they've treated his people. And then again he says, For it pertains to the appointed time of the end. Two sentences from Gabriel's mouth, messenger angel from the throne of God. Two sentences, three statements. It's about the end times, the final period of indignation. It's about the end. That's a pretty emphatic declaration concerning what the vision is about, right? So I would argue that the vision is largely about the end times. Now, what's interesting, go to the next slide, is that I also do believe that history kind of repeats itself and prophecies they have foreshadows, they have interim fulfillments, but they only have one ultimate fulfillment. And so what's interesting is when you look at this part of the world, you had that clash between Medo-Persia and Greece. That's a massive event in history. I mean, that changed that part of the world. And then later, the same two parts of the world clashed again. It was Rome and the Parthians. The Parthians were, after the Greeks kind of fell back, it was the Persians remained. The Persians still controlled the whole area, and they formed what was called the Parthian Empire. It was a Persian empire. And that was the only empire that Rome could never defeat, by the way. They were horsemen. That's why when Rome went in there and established some garrisons, they would just pull back. The Parthians would pull back, and then they would come in with like guerrilla warfare and just start picking at the garrisons. And Rome could never long-term sustain any footholds in Parthia. It was a mighty empire. And then later you had Byzantium, which was a later version, a later phase of the Roman Empire against the Sassanids, which were a latter manifestation of Parthia. Then slightly more modern times, you have the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks clashing with the Safavids. Today, it's Turkey and Iran are largely contending, the two alpha dogs contending for the heart of the Middle East, contending for Syria, contending for Iraq. Now, in the book of Daniel, it actually talks about the prince of Persia. What's the prince of Persia? The prince of Persia is a principality. It's a fallen angelic, I won't even say demonic, because that's not even technically accurate. It's a fallen, angelic, powerful being that controls, that governs that part of the world. And then you have the prince of Yavan, or Greece, that part of the world. So book of Daniel actually talks about the clash between these two regional principalities. And you go down through history, these two parts of the world are clashing over and over again. And it would be very strange, to be quite honest, if Turkey and Iran didn't clash again in the last days. They are the modern day representations of this ancient conflict that's been unfolding. Now, you have verse 22. After the prominent horn on the goat, it says at the height of his power, when the goat from the west conquers the ram, the horn is broken off. And everyone goes, well, that's when Alexander died. Because as soon as he conquered the whole Middle East, Alexander died. And then it says the broken horn, after the broken horn is broken off, 4 horns come up in place of the unicorn horn, right? So in place of the 1 horn, 4 come up. And what every commentary will say is the 4 horns represent the 4 successors to Alexander. Alexander's generals, known as the Diadochi, that's just Greek for successor, they divided up his kingdom into 4. And so that's everyone's interpretation of verse 22. It says, the broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represent 4 kingdoms, which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. And so here is a statement from John Walvoord. How many people here know who John Walvoord is? So he was the dean of Dallas Theological Seminary. He was a pretty prolific author. He's like the father of a lot of these prophecy teachers today, like David Jeremiah, a lot of these guys. He's like the grandfather. He's the guy that they read his books and then later wrote their own. A lot of them are drawn from Walvoord. And of course, Walvoord's drawn from older folks, but he had written pretty prolifically commentary on Daniel, Revelation, and a bunch of other end-time prophecy. He wrote this big encyclopedia of biblical prophecy where he goes over every single prophecy in the Bible. But here's what he says in his commentary on Daniel. He says, practically all commentators, however, recognize the 4 horns as symbolic of the 4 kingdoms of the Diadochi, which emerged as follows. He lists Cassander. We won't talk about the areas they controlled. This is pretty confusing anyway. Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. Say it again. Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. So Walvoord goes, look, virtually all commentators say that's what this is talking about. After Alexander died, these 4 guys broke up his kingdom, divided it, and that's what the prophecy is talking about. Here is the problem. That never happened in history. You go through virtually every Christian commentary and it will say that's what it's talking about. You buy a whole bunch of history books on this period of history, and there was never a time when the kingdom was divided up into 4. After Alexander died, it gets really messy. Just like, after anybody dies and all the siblings are like, mine. And essentially there were 23 to 26 different provinces. And then they all started kind of quarreling, and some of the Diadochi, some of the generals, some of the successors did start fighting. But after a series of 4 wars that unfolded over 23 years after Alexander died, there were 5. Not 4, there were 5. So to these 4, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy, there was also Antigonus. Where's Antigonus? Why does Walvoord not list Antigonus? How many people saw True Grit with John Wayne and then Jeremy Bridges? Is that right? Jeremy Bridges? Jeff Bridges. Jeff Bridges did a better job than John Wayne. He did a great job. He's this old guy, and he kept going, I'm old and fat, and he had a patch on one eye, right? And yet he would look at a guy 200 yards away and just pull out his pistol and go, right? Antigonus is Jeff Bridges, except a long time ago. His name is Antigonus Monophthalmus, Antigonus the one-eyed. Not because he was a cyclops, because he was blind in one eye. And he was way older than Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. He was way older. And he ran circles around these young guys. It's a great story. Mel Gibson should totally do a movie about it. Like, it's perfect. It's just an ancient version of True Grit. It really is. And eventually, in the Battle of Ipsus, again, 23 years after Alexander died, finally Antigonus died. He got a spear. He was in his 80s. Like, Tom Brady, your heart out, right? This guy was in his 80s, going to battle, leading on the field, and he took a spear and he finally died. And you go, okay, well, that's when there was 4. Nope, because Antigonus' son, Demetrius, took another section as soon as he died. There was still, and at that point, there was actually like a few other little small ones if you want to get technical, but by that point, 23 years after Alexander died, there were really only 2. There was the Seleucid in the north and the Egyptian or the Ptolemaic dynasty in the south. And then there was a few other smaller ones. Again, Demetrius's was a bit smaller. But so here's the thing is, once again, the common popular interpretation that we've all known is true. Walvoord goes, all commentators acknowledge it. It doesn't really fit when you actually look into the events of history. Go to the next slide. This is interesting. I did a survey of early Christian, because Walvoord goes, everyone acknowledges this. Hippolytus in 305, again, this is, 200 and, pushing 300 years after Jesus. 200, what would it be exactly, be minus 33? Don't make me do math. Hippolytus listed Seleucus, Demetrius, Ptolemy, and Philip. Where's Cassander? Where's Lysimachus? 50 years later, Ephraim the Syrian listed the same four. Eusebius, in the same year, the great church historian Eusebius, he listed Seleucus, Antigonus, Ptolemy, and Philip. So the only difference there is he switches out Demetrius with Antigonus. About 50 years later, I guess that would be 52 years later, Jerome, he maintains Eusebius' list. And in 430, Theodoret from Syria, Cyrus, he listed Seleucus, Antigonus, Ptolemy, and Antipater. Where did Antipater come from? The point is this. For the first 400 years of the early church, no one could agree on which four. They go, this must be the events of history. But if it was so clear, you think there would be some consensus. But there's really not. In modern times, there is, because this is a problem within academia, within scholarship, which is this. A student goes to university, goes to seminary, whatever, he goes to, become a scholar. He sits under his teacher, and basically this is what they do. They repeat what their teacher says. And then they write it in their own words, and then they come out with a book. And teachers do this today. And then when you look at the sources that they cite their fathers. But they don't really often have like this real broad overview. And so it becomes an echo chamber. We're just repeating what we've heard from all of our teachers. And that's good. That's good. I mean, we should stand on the shoulders of godly men, but ultimately we need to be good students of the Scriptures, not just good students of our teachers. And this is a deficit in the church. We go, I pick my team. I go, I like this teacher, I like that one. That's the guy that I stick with the Scriptures. Don't go, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of this one. No, I'm a student of the Scriptures. Be a Berean. And it's such an easy trap to fall into. So the point is this. One of the big problems with this being fulfilled in history is that history doesn't fit. The four don't fit. Secondly, let's see here if I've got it. Yeah, well, there's actually, so I'm going to do something to you. Go back until just the slide after the picture of Alexander the Great. One more. One more. Yep, right there. Okay. The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. You go, well, there it is, settled. Ancient history. The shaggy goat with the one horn is the kingdom of Greece, right? The large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So that's whenever it goes Alexander the Great. And they go, and it names ancient names, so it must be ancient kingdoms. Here's the problem. First of all, let's say that we're talking about Ezekiel 38-39, the battle of Gog-Magog. Everyone acknowledges that that is an end-time prophecy. But what are the names of the nations that are invading Israel? Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah, Bet Togarmah, Put, and Cush, right? You go, those are ancient names. But we go, it's an end-time prophecy. So what we do is we go, where were those peoples in Ezekiel's day? And what regions do they correlate today? Well, they correlate to Iran, Turkey, Sudan, right? So we go, these are the nations that will, and some others, that will invade Israel. It uses ancient names because that's the only names they had. And then when we get here to Daniel, we go, well, it's Media Persia, therefore it must be ancient Media Persia. I go, why the inconsistency? If this is an end-time prophecy, as Gabriel said, where was Media and Persia? Well, that's modern-day Iran. What about Greece? Well, we know Greece. We know Wekos yogurt. We know Zorba the Greek, right? Right? Like whatever. We know the Greek islands. The word there in Hebrew, this is important, is Yavan. It's not Greece. It's Yavan. And in Daniel's day, in the 5th century, Greece didn't even exist yet. Daniel wouldn't have looked at this and said Greece. He would have said it's the region of Yavan. Now, skip forward, boom, 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 until you get to the next map. Where is Yavan? Yavan would have included the Greek islands, but it also included Western Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. So the angelic interpretation is that this is the region of Iran and the region of Turkey. That's where they're coming from. That's the regions that they're coming from, right? Let me do one other thing here. And then here's the other problem, is Alexander the Great was like the 33rd king of Macedonia. He wasn't the first king of Greece. His father was Philip, king of Macedonia. He was not the first king of Greece. So that's another historical problem. Like the point is, there's actually multiple historical problems with the historical interpretation. I'm not saying the events of history aren't a foreshadow. What I'm saying is the ultimate fulfillment arguably is yet to come. So now go to the next slide. So essentially what it's saying, in very simple terms, is in the last days there'd be this clash between Iran and arguably Turkey. Now, could it be Greece? Maybe. But it's that part of the world. When the Bible says Yavan, it's actually thinking much more Asia Minor than it is the Greek islands. So that's kind of an important factor to consider. And so a summary is essentially there'll be this clash of the ram and the goat. Actually, yeah, just leave it there for a minute. And then the leader, the prominent horn from the goat, dies. Whoever that prominent leader is dies. And then out of that goat, that kingdom, that empire, comes 4 horns. It divides into 4. And then out of one of those comes the Antichrist. Okay, so you've got the 4. Now, go back to the previous slide, the map. So I work with the underground church in Iran, and we work in Iraq. We've got teams in Iraq with the ministry that I'm part of, Frontier Alliance International. We're getting into Syria. We've got people all over the Middle East with different ministries. Global Catalytic Ministries. If any of you saw Sheep Among Wolves, Global Catalytic Ministries is working throughout the Middle East. FAI, Frontier Alliance, is working throughout the Middle East. And I get to go over there and visit quite a bit, but I don't live over there. But I do have a pretty good grasp on unfolding Middle Eastern geopolitics. We're here in February 2020. In the end of January, the beginning of February 2015, 5 years ago, ISIS exploded out of Syria in June of 2014. So 6 months later, Dalton Thomas, he's the director of Frontier Alliance International, and a team of us, we went over to northern Iraq. That was our first. We were like, we need to get over there. And you go, well, wait a minute, ISIS, why did you want to get over there? Because the natural tendency of people is when they see what Satan's doing, they retreat as quickly and as far as possible. I'm of the opinion that if Jesus was on the earth, he rushes into crisis. He rushes toward crisis because that's where the greatest need is. And, there was all kinds of refugees, displaced peoples, genocide. We were watching what was happening with ISIS. It was brutal. And we were saying, Lord, this is a tremendous kingdom opportunity, right? So we got over there, and I sat down and I taught what I just taught you for the first time ever publicly, and we recorded it. I threw it on YouTube. And I said this at the time. I said, guys, I'm not someone to say, Daniel 8 seems to be talking about a last days Iranian invasion of the Middle East, followed by a Turkish response, and then eventually that new Turkey, whatever it is, breaks up into 4, out of which comes the Antichrist. I go, that's what the text seems to be saying. However, I'm not someone to say, this is that. This is the watch, like I'm a prophet. No, I'm just trying to interpret the scriptures. And I said this, but if we see Iran invade Iraq over the next few years, I said, then we really need to pay attention. We really need to pay attention. And then if Turkey begins responding, At that point, I'll probably push the button and say, this is that. This is one of the most detailed roadmaps for the rise of the Antichrist in the last days. And so over the past 5 years, I've watched, and you go, well, has Iran invaded Iraq? Yeah, they have. How did that happen? Iran works primarily through proxies. They don't primarily just send in armies. They work through proxies. So in Lebanon, they use Hezbollah. They send funding. They give ideological support. They help support Hassan Nasrallah, the ideological leader of Hezbollah. They get their spidery fingers into Syria using their puppet of Bashar Assad. They control down south of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and they do that through proxies. They're doing it over in Afghanistan. They use money. They use influence. They raise up in their backyard their junkyard dogs, but there's always plausible deniability, right? Until, just like last week, Yemen on the batteries that launched their missiles had Iranian Farsi computer modules. Like, whoops, where'd that come from? But generally they try to say, we didn't have anything to do with that. That's the crazy Hezbollah, right? So the United States can't really act against Iran unless, unless they have solid proof. So they're always kind of like trying to deny it, but it's obvious who's at it, but that's how they do it. They play the long game. They're very patient. What's happened the past 5 years in Iraq is, again, America was at war in Iraq for years, and a lot of including Afghanistan and Iraq, 4,000 American lives gone in Iraq. The country's a complete mess. But we have the Iraqi military that we supposedly work with, or we used to work with. But what started appearing, because we're up in the north, up in the Kurdish areas, and they started appearing a few years ago, is this militia. And it's a Shia militia. Now, Iran is Shia. That's the minority sect of Islam, about 15% of the Muslim world. Sunni world is like 85%. And and Iraq is partially Shia, partially Sunni. The Shia militia starts popping up. They're called the Hasht al-Shabi, or in American media it will be the Popular Mobilization Units. Now it's called the Popular Mobilization Forces. And little by little, they started taking over to where eventually, within a few years, get this, they became as powerful, if not more powerful, than the Iraqi military. A militia eventually, and who was their general? Qasem Soleimani, the guy that we just killed about a month ago. He was an Iranian general. Okay, so this was an Iran. What I'm saying is this was an Iranian invasion of Iraq. It was an Iranian takeover of Iraq. And just because we took out Soleimani doesn't mean that Iran doesn't still have control of Iraq. They do. Now, this is not an overt invasion with tanks and marching soldiers, but it is an invasion, and they have butted out to the north, to the east, and to the west. Is something more overt going to come? Based on the language of the text, I would probably imagine yes, but by the same token, in a lot of ways, it's unfolding. Well, then Turkey, of course, is beginning to respond. And unfortunately, we, the United States, have been giving Turkey permission to do this. President Erdogan of Turkey, for whatever reason, in my opinion, is like the emerging Hitler of our time. And we keep continuing to treat him like he's a great ally. And we've given Erdogan permission to invade the Kurdish regions of northern Syria that's controlled, I know this is getting technical, controlled by the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Guys, if there is one group in the Middle East that represents American values, it's the SDF. It's Sunnis, it's Arabs, it's Kurds, it's Christians, and they all are coming together saying, look, we're sick of all of this sectarian ISIS nonsense. Let's work together. If you're willing to, not hate your neighbors and fight for a more democratic, peaceful region, let's do that. And we're treating them like they're terrorists because Turkey is terrified of the Kurds. And that's all kind of technical. So we've been giving Turkey the rights, permission, for all intents and purposes, to invade Syria, which they have been doing, and they've been partnering with groups that are basically like ISIS to do so. So in the same way that Iran uses all of these Shia militia, Turkey uses proxies called ISIS and other groups like it. They all use their own proxies and so forth. So am I saying that this thing is being fulfilled right now? Yes and no. I'm saying it's amazing that 2,500 years ago, Daniel gave us a really incredibly detailed prophecy that the geopolitical landscape of the earth today, that part of the region, is lining up exactly with what he described. And I would expect to see it more overt than just the beginning stages, but these things take time. And so I would say we need to watch this part of the world. Does Iran continue to break out throughout the region? Does Turkey eventually respond? If so, would the prominent leader of Turkey die shortly thereafter? And that would have to, if it's in our time right now, it would have to be Erdogan. And you go, well, how is he the first king? And I go, again, going back to the failed coup of 2017, Erdogan has systematically beheaded the system set up by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, and he set himself up as basically king. He's like Putin, he's like the czar, whatever you want to call it. And so if these things begin to unfold, I would say we have probably one of the clearest roadmaps in front of us, Daniel chapter 8, for the rise of the Antichrist. I still am not there to where I want to say this is that. What I'm saying is we need to pay attention. This is something that we need to watch. Study this chapter, study it more, pay attention to the news, watch and pray. And, maybe it'll be different than what I'm imagining, but it just seems to really be aligning. And if that's the case, then again, this Turkish leader would have success. No one would be able to defeat him. He would really invade the whole Middle East, defeat Iran. The prominent leader would die. There would be sort of a new Turkey, if you will. And they're open about wanting to do that, by the way. They're open in the news saying, this was taken from us with the Sykes-Picot Treaty back in the early 20th century. We got ripped off. They remember the Ottoman Empire. They want to bring it back. They want to go back to the Ottoman Empire. So that would be kind of revived, and then it would be broken into four. When this prominent leader dies, something would happen, political turmoil, breaks up into four, out of which comes the Antichrist. And so it's a pretty clear roadmap. I think, as I said, it's definitely worth paying attention to, but time will tell. We need to be humble. We need to be cautious. We need to be careful. We need to be prayerful. And we don't want to be the boy that cries wolf that says, this is that, this is that, this is that. Because Christians and prophecy folks have done enough of that. Amen? All right, I'm going to pray. Father, we ask that you would give us wisdom in the days ahead. We ask that you would give us discernment, give us eyes to see. We ask that we would be a people prepared, that we would be a people filled with prayer, and that we wouldn't shrink back when we see the unfolding of biblical prophecy, the unfolding of the things that Satan is wanting to do, because we know, God, that you are far more busy than he is, and that you are leading a multitude to faith throughout that whole region. In the midst of the chaos and the catastrophe, you are bringing many people to you. We ask that we would see the good in the midst of the bad, the redemptive in the midst of the difficult, and we would stand with those that are broken, those that are downtrodden, outcast, needy, afflicted, rejected, marginalized, hated, displaced peoples. And we ask that our heart would imitate yours, and that we would have a heart for the lost and the needy, and that we would open our mouths and speak life, speak the words of life into those that need to hear it. So we thank you for all of these things. We commit them to you in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.